well, I will not go into that, but many of these concepts have traveled into different languages, even though with different meanings. And also many things that came from Europe, critical concepts that came from Europe, also have traveled into many Indian languages. You know, many critics in modern India come from the English discussers, so they have been inspired by T.S. Eliot or I.A. Richards, or even earlier, critics like Sir Philip Sidney, or even earlier like Aristotle and Longinus to begin with, and later by all these structuralists and post from Roland Barthes to Michel Foucault and Derrida and Jacques Rancière, Agamben, and quite a lot of others. I'm not taking names. So many critics have been inspired both by European critics and by ancient Indian critics. That is also something common to many of the literatures of India. So I will sum up the argument for the singular Indian literature. What are the arguments? One, that language is not the only criterion of literature. So Nihar Ranjan Ray is not right. There can be other arguments, other standards for measuring, understanding, and interpreting literatures. That is like class, race, caste, sign, structure, archetype, ideology, unconscious, etc. All these can be the basis of understanding literature, not only language. Secondly, that there are many literatures which are written there are many literatures where writers exist who have written or who have composed in many languages at the same time. So a history of any single language. So they cannot be part of a single history of a language, but they have to be part of what can be called Indian literature only. You can call Kabir only an Indian writer and not a Hindi writer. Thirdly, there are common patterns of evolution. I said tribal period, epic period, Sanskrit period, and then Bhakti period, the period of freedom movement and reform, the progressive period, the modern period, the postmodern period. I mean, just to give some examples. Then I said common categories or genres like Mahakavya, Prabandha, Sandesh Kavya, Natak, or lyric, ghazal, short story, novel, etc. And then I said critical concept that came from Sanskrit and from the West, from Vakrokti and Anumana and Thwani and Rasa to structuralist and deconstructive concepts. And then I said influences, I did not say perhaps, influences, there are common influences on many languages. If you look at all the movements in India, modern India, you will find they have been influenced and impacted by many of the foreign writers and foreign movements. Not only in Europe, but in South America, besides, of course, Sanskrit, which has had an impact on most of the Indian languages, and Tamil, which has impacted most of the South Indian languages. These are the arguments for the possibility of a single Indian literature. A possibility, I will just call it so for the time being. I will look at the counter. I am taking a lot of time. Am I? Well, I will just look at the counter argument. Yeah, do you want to say something? Am I taking more time than you wanted me to take?
No, sir. No, sir.
Is it okay? Yeah, okay. I will look at counter arguments. I'll be brief now. Let us take them one by one. One is language. Yes, we agree that language is not fundamental. There are many criteria using which literature can be understood, measured, and critiqued. But important. That is the counter argument, because ultimately a piece of work is written in even you can speak of multilingual writers, but you cannot speak of multilingual works. If you look at one work by Kamaladas, it is written either in Malayalam or English. You know, sometimes without our knowledge, she translated also, because I have discovered some of the stories were turned into Malayalam stories were turned into poems in English, etc. While writing a long introduction to Kamaladas's poetry on her own request, I discovered this. But anyway, her English poems are written in English and her Malayalam stories are written in Malayalam. And it is true about other writers also. So writers can be multilingual, but works are written in languages. That is a counter argument. And then look at the movements. Look at or let us look at the evolution. If you have a close look, it is true. There is an evolution. As I said, there is a tribal literature, Bhakti literature, Sanskrit literature, and modern and postmodern literatures. But if you look closely, what we call Bhakti literature, we use the word in retrospect. Look back, it looks like a movement. But were the poets aware that they were taking part in a movement? No. Kabir knew nothing about Namadev. Namadev knew nothing about Basava. Basava knew nothing about Tirumular. And Tirumular, of course, he was one of the beginners of the Bhakti movement, and so he knew only about Shiva and not about many Bhakti writers. And so they wrote independently. And somehow, when we look back today, when we look at the whole corpus, we call it a movement. But if you look at them closely, there were many movements within that movement. For example, there were Shaivites, like I said, the Tamil Shaivites and the Kannada Shaivites. There are Vaishnavites. If you look at Andal or Avayar, they were essentially Vaishnavite poets. I mean, you have heard of the Alvars and the Namalvars in Tamil, whom Ramanujan has translated. So there were Vaishnavite poets, and there were Shakteyas who worshipped Shakti. And if you look at their philosophical systems, philosophical systems that inspired them, they were also different. Some were Advaitic poets, some were Vishishta Advaitins, some followed Sankhya, and even some of the early poets were Buddhist poets. They also belong in a larger sense. They also belong to the Bhakti tradition. They were Bhaktas of the Buddha, even though Buddha in having bhaktas, very much like Srinarayana Guru, they not want people to be his bhaktas, but we have his bhaktas everywhere. Like Buddha also had bhaktas, and some of the early you have read Susi Taru's anthology of Indian women's literature from the 6th century to the present, and it begins with those early Buddhist nuns who wrote liberatory, emancipatory poems. So they believed in the Buddhist tradition. There were Jain Bhakta poets. So if you look at Bhakti poetry closely, you will find there are differences in philosophical moorings. There are differences in the gods or goddesses that they worshipped. So I was translating bhajanas, and I found that they were not worshipping even the same Shiva. So somebody was worshipping Kodala Sangama Deva, like Basava. Somebody was worshipping Guheshwara, like Allah Prabhu. So you find that even different forms of Shiva or different Shivalingas found in different temples were being worshipped. So which means if you look very closely, there is endless diversity even within the, you can call it a movement in a very, very broad sense. So if you look through a telescope, it looks like a movement. But if you look through a microscope, it looks like so many movements and so many cults and so many belief systems which underlie many of these poets and their ways. And also there were differences in the may have heard Kumar Gandharv or Mallikarjun Mansoor singing some of the beautiful abhangs of Tukaram. So it was called, there were many forms. I will not go into that. That is another area of study. The forms that were created during Bhakti. Because Bhakti did such contribution to Indian literature, undeniable contribution, because most of our dances, most of our poetic forms come from Bhakti. I will only just name some of them, which you can try to Google and try to understand. See, there was Doha, Ulat Basi, Bharamasa, Wak, VAKH, Wak. It is a Kashmiri form used by Shaivites like Lalded, who was a Kashmiri Shaivite poet and a Sufi poet at the same time. She is called Laleshwari by Hindus, and she is called Lalla Arifa by the Muslims. Kashmir has a tradition called Kashmiriyat, where the Hindu and the Muslim saints are common to both Hindus and Muslims. Well, there was Walk, there was Vachana, then Kirtan, Bhajan. There were various forms invented by the Dalit saint poets like Raidas and Chokhamela and Karmamela. And there were also many Muslims very well know. Rahim, Reza Khan, Salabega. There were bhaktas of, or Kabir himself. They were bhaktas of Rama or Krishna, and they used some of the forms which came from Persian and Arabic. So if you look at all these differences, you will find Bhakti poets. It was a movement in a very broad sense, but it also had a lot of a diversity in terms of form, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the cult, in terms of philosophical systems that underlie them. So and then if you look at other, because we spoke of the parallel evolution. So you already we have discussed Bhakti. If you look at other movements also, you find similar kinds of development. We spoke of Sanskrit, the glorious period of Sanskrit. But then we forget movements happening in India at the same time. One was the Buddhist and the Jain literatures. There were a lot of Buddhist texts produced. There were including the Dasharatha Jataka and Jain texts like Paumacharita and Vasudeva Hindi produced at the same time in Pali. And there were the Sangam texts in Tamil being produced at the same time in the south. So even though we speak of a pan-Indian Sanskrit period, at the same period, we had also Pali, Abhapramsh, we had Prakrit, we had Tamil, and obviously we had many tribal languages creating their own oral literatures. So all movements, well, there were movements common, but at the same time there were also many parallel movements happening. And even these movements did not happen in the same way. If you look closely at them, you will find a lot of different. What we call Adhunikata is not necessarily what the Kannadigas would call Navya, or what the Hindi speaking people would call or Nai Kavita. They all of them mean new, but they mean different things by them. And if you look at their modern poetry and our modern poetry, their modern fiction and our modern fiction, you will find a lot of difference. So it is very difficult to compare, say, something like Khasakinde Idihasam, the great modern epic in Malayalam fiction, with a novel by Nirmal Verma, or a novel by Krishna Baldev Vaid, who had other sources of inspiration, because Krishna Baldev Vaid in Hindi was inspired mostly by Milan Kundera, and Nirmal Verma was inspired a lot by Samuel Beckett, while Vijayan was inspired by many of the English writers and some of the Latin American writers. So you find these kinds of differences even among the modern writers. And this is true about other movements also. Progressive writers were inspired by different writers. Sometimes the Malayalam progressive writers were inspired very much by Premchand. But Premchand himself, by writers like Balzac and Emile Zola and Maupassant and similar other writers from European languages. So progressive literature also existed in different forms. You cannot simply compare, say, Premchand's Godan with, say, Takari's Chemin or Kayar. You could find some, if you go deep, you may find some similarities here and there, but they were different works, because they came from very different social backgrounds. And so they both were the progressive writers in some sense, but they were inspired by a progressive ideology, which was a combination of Gandhian and Marxian. They came from different social backgrounds, and because of that, their languages were different. The way they perceived life, there were differences in that. There were differences in their aesthetics and in their form, and this can be said about all movements. There were movements cutting across languages, but all these movements manifested themselves differently in different languages. And then another thing we said was forms. Forms are what I called the genres of literature. I said about Mahakavya, or Sandesh Kavya, other things which are common. But there are common forms, no doubt. But there are also forms which are there only in the languages. This is the counter argument. For example, Tamil has a lot of forms which are very specific to Tamil. Even though some of them traveled into Malayalam or other South Indian, like Kummi, for example. Kummi is a Tamil form, which later traveled also into Malayalam. Or there is Chind. Chind is a kind of song in Tamil. Or there is Akaval. Akaval is a kind of verse narrative. They have their own rules. And there is Venpa. Venpa is a didactic thing. You are trying to teach something to someone. So it is Venpa. And there is also Kalipa. Kalipa is a poem. There is Vanchappa. Vanchappa is a kind of descriptive kind of poem. Vanchappa. And there is Kumi, which is a dance poem. And there is Kanni, which is a kind of couplet. Something like those. And in Malayalam also, if you want to look at Malayalam, is there Tullal Katha? You can say it is a dance, but it is also literature. Nambiar is also a writer. So there is no Tullal in any other language in India. There are many other forms in other languages in India, but there is no Tullal. And look at Attakatha. Attakatha is very specific to us. There are many similar things, in Karnataka, for example, but and also in some other regions of India. But then Attakatha as a literature or a text like Nalacharitam is very specific to Malayalam. So Tullal, Attakatha. And if you want something modern, let me see this. I have told my friends and they were surprised. We have something called Patala Katha. And I asked many of my friends in other languages, do you have Patala Katha? And they asked me, what is it? I said, it means barrack stories or stories written by actual serving soldiers with the army barrack as the background. And I said, we have many writers. We had Ekalavian, we had Parapuratha. There's a whole tradition of soldier stories in Malayalam. And no, in other language, here and there you may find one story or two stories written in that background, but there is no genre. There is no particular form called Patala Katha. So these are only 3 examples from Malayalam. And some examples I have from Tamil. I'm going to go on giving examples from all languages. Forms which are very specific to that language alone. So there are common forms, but there are also forms which are very specific to those languages. Bijak and Ramaini you find only in the Braj language. Rubai, Masnavi, Khawali, Hitta, Manakub, Nama, Kasida. You find them only in Urdu, not in other Indian languages. Though Ghazal traveled, but other forms did not travel so much. And these originally came from Persian. The Rubai, you have heard of the Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam. Rubaiyat means a collection of rubais. Rubai is a particular verse form, like we speak of haiku or shingaki and other forms. And then what about critical concepts? That was another connecting link. From Sanskrit and Europe, we have received common critical concepts. But if you look at concepts you find, do you find the Tinai concept in Sanskrit? No. It is a very typical Tamil concept, which you got from Tolhapiyam. I'm not going into the description of Tinai. You just find it out. You will find a lot about Tinai in Wikipedia or other sources. Just to say, Tinai poetics in modern times, it is an eco-poetics. It is an eco-poetics because it is based on environment. Because it speaks about specific regions, like the mountain region, the seashore, etc., or the plain, etc. It speaks of the fauna and the flora, the animals and the plants belonging to that particular region. It belongs to the mood or the feeling associated with that region, which could be sadness, which could be love, which could be many other forms. And so there was a whole poetics based on the character of the region. And each region was called a Tinai, like the Mullai Tinai. Well, I will not go into all those, the whole Tinai aesthetic. So this Tinai aesthetic is a Tamil kind of aesthetic. And there was nothing like that in Sanskrit. So don't some say only Sanskrit had histories. Tamil had its own poetics, and there was a Kannada text called Kaviraja Marga, which was very different from the Sanskrit text. It was written by someone called Sri Vijaya, even though the identity is not clearly known. But someone called Sri Vijaya wrote Kavi Raja Marga, which was a poetics text, a text of poetics in Kannada, and even common with the different meanings, different nuances and subtle differences from one language into another. Because what we mean by 20 may not be the same thing that a Hindi speaker means by the word 20, or a Bangla speaker means when he uses the word 20. There may be many, and 20 already has many interpretations. And the latest one is that 20 is what remains after reading, because generally 20 is explained very simply. Because Anandavarthan is one of the most misunderstood poeticians in Sanskrit, and very often we think that 20 means a kind of association, or something that rings, because in Malayalam 20 also means that something that rings in your ears or in your memory when you hear a word. No, it means reading a text first vertically and then horizontally, and then something remains, an essence, a bhava, a mood, maybe a nameless grief, a sorrow that you cannot name, that remains at the end. And that is what you call 20. What remains after your vertical reading of the poem line by line, and then a horizontal reading that is trying to understand it as a totality. And then after all that, something remains. And what remains after reading the poem in your memory, in your experience, in your heart or mind, whatever you call it, that ultimately is 20. So 20 has traveled with many meanings into many languages. And also the influences have varied. We spoke here of Derrida and Foucault. Malayalis, at least Malayalam literature students might know the names of Foucault and Derrida, even though they might not have read grammatology, or Birth of the Prison, or the Clinic, or many of their texts. But then, if I say the same, if I go to Odisha, I am not demeaning anybody. But if I go to Odisha and speak about Derrida and Foucault, most of them will ask. There are scholars there also, but most of them will ask who was Derrida, who was Foucault. So that means all the writers, all the critics have not traveled into all languages equally at the same time. They came into different languages at different points of time. These writers also might reach other languages at a later point of time. And sometimes many writers came together, and that's why there's a lot of confusion in critical method, even in Malayalam. So, and there's a lot of eclecticism, because we use many methods. Even when you analyze a single poem, you may be using many methods. You may quote Foucault here, you may quote Derrida there, you may quote Ayerichat somewhere else, you may quote Aristotle in the same text. So there is a lot of eclecticism in Malayalam, a mixing of concepts. That is natural, because many of these ideas came to us together. And this happens also with the influences. We will come to that. So critical concepts, there are common critical concepts, but there are specific critical concepts, and also other critical concepts traveled with different meanings into different languages. And then we spoke of movements, and that I have already touched upon. Bhakti movement, modern movement, all of them have different meanings in different languages. And then if you look at languages themselves, if you look at the origins of language, you will come to know that is, languages originated at different periods of history in different regions. The Tamil and Sanskrit may have a history of at least 3,000 years. We are not very sure about that, but near about 3,000 years. Kannada is said to have a history of 1,500 years. Marathi and Malayalam have a history of 800 years, and then a prehistory of another 500 or so. Then Odia has a history of 500 years. Indian English, you have to accept it as an Indian language now, has a history of 200 years. And besides languages, we have also what we call dialects, which may be even older than the languages, because they were there first, and later they developed into languages for various reasons. Sometimes scholars worked in them to turn them into languages, standardize them, created grammar, created dictionary, like Gundert and Father Arnaud did for us. So they created, in some sense, they created languages by they were creating a dictionary or a lexicon, creating a grammar. These are fundamental needs of creating a language, and this happened in many languages. So so dialects became languages with specific rules, specific grammar, specific dictionaries, and all that. And there is this saying in English that a dialect becomes a language when it has a political party and an army. So I often think there is some truth in that. Excuse me for saying this. If you look at Bodo language and Bhojpuri language, Bodo is now one of the recognized languages in India. It is recognized by an 8th schedule of the constitution, very much like Malayalam or Bengali or Marathi. It is a recognized language. And how did this happen? Because Bodos became militant. They had a party, they had an army, and the government had to finally accept it. They had to give them a Bodo land and accept Bodo as a language. But the poor Bhojpuris, there are 3 times as many Bhojpuri speakers as Bodo speakers by census, by linguistic statistics. But Bhojpuri is still an unrecognized language because they still do not have a party and do not have an army. So, so it is not an innocent process. This change of a dialect into a language, or this heightening of a dialect into a language. So we have, what I meant was, we have languages, we have also dialects. Then we speak of influences. I have already touched upon that. These influences sometimes came together. So that is why I am very doubtful, even though when sometimes we speak of the romantic movement in Malayalam. But did we have a romantic movement? I think we need to find out another word. Of course, sometimes we use the word, which is not bad. Like Hriday Umari has written a whole beautiful book on Kalpanikata in Malayalam, and we use the word Kalpanik. It is not bad because imagination or fancy is a central point, the central thing in Romanticism, and that way Kalpanikata is a good word. But I do not think, even when I speak in English, I can speak of romantic poetry in Malayalam in the way in which I can speak of romantic poetry in English or romantic poetry in French. I can speak of Wordsworth and Shelley and Byron and Keats and say they were romantics because they were inspired by certain philosophers. Was the inspiration of Immanuel Kant. There was some inspiration from Hegel. There was inspiration from Rousseau. So there were many common, philosophical foundations. There were common attitudes, common features to many of these poets. But it is very difficult to call all our so-called romantic poets, to put them together in the same basket. You can put Shelley and Byron in the same basket. They may have minor quarrels, but they will remain in the same basket. But you cannot put Vallatol and Changambura in the same basket. There will be a battle. So we call them all romantics, Kalpanika Kavigal. But I am very, very doubtful about. I am doubtful about many things. I am a doubter basically. And so I am very doubtful about the use of such words. So so modernism, romanticism, classicism. When we speak of these words in our languages, we have to be, at least we have to be cautious. We have to be careful. You may use them, but you have to qualify them. You cannot use them mechanically like we use them in English or in French or German or other European languages. So because these influences came together, that is why even today, look at the Malayalam poetic scene. Just to take a simple example with which you are very familiar. So we have poets who write in what is called the Kalpanika or the romantic style. We have poets who write like old Sanskrit poets who retell old stories and who use even Sanskrit meters. There are poets who write in free verse. There are poets who write in prose. And there are poets who write in prose, the prose of the everyday kind of prose. And all of them exist at the same time. I mean, chronologically speaking, they all exist at the same time. Even though aesthetically speaking, they may be existing at different time zones. Because there is an aesthetic history where you look at sensibility. And if you look at sensibilities, there may be a very modern sensibility, there may be another kind of modern sensibility, there may be an old sensibility, there may be a medieval sensibility, there may be a romantic sensibility. They may all be living at the same time, but they may be living in different times in terms of their creativity, their imagination, and their expression. And the language they use etc. So that is one example. So you can, it is not simultaneous. In fact, Malayalam literature has never been simultaneous with its time. We have had poets and who write using many sensibilities and having many influences, writing at the same period in our literary history. That also complicates our literary history. And so if you look at native histories, the histories, because we always tend to think in terms of modern states. After the linguistic stage, we tend to think in terms of Assam, West Bengal, Orissa, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh. No more Andhra Pradesh now. Maybe Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. But this is a new map. But much before this map, languages, people of different languages existed in different periods, and they belong to different parts of India. So it is very difficult to write histories of either languages or regions in India. And there were sub-traditions within traditions, as I have already said. If you look at novel or bhakti poetry, etc., or travel writing, there are many sub-traditions within traditions. And then translations also. Even the idea of translation is very difficult to define in India, because was Eduthachen a translator? He took a lot from Adhyatma Ramayana, Sanskrit Adhyatma Ramayana, but he also took a lot from Valmiki Ramayana. He took a lot from other Ramayanas. There is a context where Rama says, "Don't come with me into the forest." I was speaking about the first visit, when they were they were really in love. Then Sita says, "No, no, no. In every other Ramayana, Rama takes Sita with him. Why don't you take me?" So today we will call it intertextual. We have this great word from the West, but Tachan was intertextual in that sense. He is referring to many other Ramayana that he had read whatever Ramayana was available in Tamil and Malayalam and Sanskrit at that point of time, and so obviously, because there are references to all of them in his Ramayana, and so it is very difficult to speak about the translations and adaptations were not very different in other literatures. So I will conclude now. Already I am late. We need to develop a concept of literature which is inclusive, which should include, first, it should include oral and performative literatures. Particularly when you speak about India, we have such a rich repertoire of folk literature and performance literature that without them, our idea of literature will never be complete. A good part of our literature was written for performance, for Bharatanatyam, for Mohiniyattam, for Kaigotikali, for Kathakali, for Tullal, for Ramanattam, for Krishnanattam, for Bayalata, for Harikatha, for Burakatha, for various kinds of performances across India, for Ramlila, Krishnalila, other things, and also various kinds of theatre and dances, or to be sung, oral literature. So without taking oral literature and performative literature into our idea of literature, will never be complete. Secondly, we have to say one single continuous history of Indian literature is an impossibility. We have to discover alternative models. And one such model has been given by Sheldon Pollock, as I said, Literary Cultures in History, because there different critics are looking at the histories of their literatures. And so if you have a history of Indian literature, it can have different chapters where each chapter delineates the evolution of one Indian literature. And it also addresses the gaps and the silences and the unevenness among the different literatures. And if you look at if you look at the concept of inclusivity, I should also say we should look at periods of common influences and periods of isolated growth. because in all our literary histories, there are periods when there were common, like I said, the progressive movement. Maupassant and Emile Zola and Balzac and Tolstoy, they influenced progressive movements in most places. And modern movement was influenced by Ezra Pound and Eliot and, and even, Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Rilke and many other, yeah, and later European and, Latin American and African writers. It could be Pablo Neruda, it could be Marquez or Llosa. So they influenced our literature. So different writers influenced different literatures at different periods. But there were also periods when each literature grew on its own without sharing the influences with other literatures. So in each literary history, you will find a period of isolated growth and also a period of common influence. So what we need ultimately is a new cartography. I hope you know the word, the art of map making. So we need a new way of literary map making. We need a new literary cartography where we mark areas of difference and areas of similarity. That is the only way we can develop a comparative literature, a concept of comparative Indian literature. We need to mark areas of difference and areas of similarity. We need to compare the various literatures of India and understand their common influences and impacts and also their differences. Let us understand that literature exists not in any empty space, but in a network of relationships, of peoples, of cultures, of languages. No literature exists in total isolation. It is related to the history of the people who produced that literature, the history of the different cultures that gave birth to those great literary works. It is related to the history of the particular region from where it came to be. And so that is why I said literature does not exist in an empty space. It is a network of relationships of peoples, cultures, and languages. And in India, poetry and philosophy are often hard to separate. This is my own. I'm not saying I have invented something new, but this is my own way of theorizing it. See, if you give Bhagavad Gita to a Westerner, he would say this is a philosophical text. But is it not also a text of poetry? See, look at the Dashamaskandha of Bhagavata, which deals with various philosophical systems. So do we call it poetry? Do we call it philosophy? So in India particularly, and what about Bhakti poetry? So read Kabir, read Allama Prabhu, read Basava, read even Edachan or Puntanam. Are they writing philosophy? Are they writing poetry? So in Indian literature, Indian poetry particularly, what I find is there is a kind of organic relationship between poetry and philosophy. I am not saying that there is no philosophy in poetry written in other parts of India, but in Indian poetry, there is a very genuine, very deep, inseparable and organic link between poetry and philosophy at the same time. And yeah, I have already given you plenty of examples. And again, identity in Indian literature is not often of individuals but of communities, because even the idea of authorship came to India much later. We have a lot of anonymous poets about folk poetry. Who knows even who wrote Maveli Nadu Vani Kalam? We know who popularized them, but we do not know. And we do not know about many of those early. Of course, we impute authorship to some poets, but we are not very sure about the authorship. And we do not know about many earlier folk poems. What is that? That kind of folk poem. We do not know who wrote them. And even early texts in Sanskrit, many of them are anonymous. Or even if there is a name, for example, Vyasa, we know nothing about Vyasa. We have legends about Vyasa. But all the modern scholars agree that there was no single Vyasa, but there were many Vyasas, and Mahabharata developed over time. So this we have read in all the studies of Mahabharata over the last 60 years at least. And so Vyasa is just a name, an imaginary name given to an imaginary author. And we do not know much about Valmiki. We do not know much about even Kalidasa, even though we say he was one of the seven jewels in Vikramaditya's court, etc. We know very little about his life. Only we have legends or hagiographies. And so there is a lot of anonymity in our writing. And the idea of the author was a later invention. It came mainly because of the influence of the West, but mostly it was a community product more than an individual product. And it was more social than personal, related to social context than personal context. Even though later lyric came, elegy came, and poetry became more personal, but earlier it was more impersonal and more social. Then the name became important, copyright became important, author became important. We began to speak of plagiarism, etc. But we never say Srinarayana Guru was a plagiarist or Elthachan was a plagiarist, because even though they did take a lot from them, but we should not even look at them from that modern point of view of authorship, because it was a common, it was like an ocean from which they would have taken something. They would have taken something from another part of the ocean also. And but it was their own work ultimately, because they brought their own imagination, their creativity, their understanding of meter, their understanding of language into their work. And so Indian culture existed in regional cultures, repositories of cultural memories, archives of regional imagination. Because each Indian language is an archive of regional imagination. It is a repository of cultural memory. And so, in short, single language cultures are like pruned gardens, but multilingual literature, like Indian literature, is like an endless forest. I have used this metaphor in one of my poems, but not in this context. I speak about two kinds of poets. Some are like forests and some are like pruned, beautiful gardens. They look very beautiful, but their range is very limited. But there are forests where you find all kinds of plants and trees growing, and you do not know to which to choose. And this can be said also about Indian literary culture. It is a multilingual culture. It is like a dense, thick forest, and not a well-cut, pruned forest, like a small European literature, say Dutch literature. Well, it's a beautiful garden. But Indian literature is like the forest, described in Yuddhakan, or in Aranyakanda, for example. So it's a huge corpus or body of literature. So we need to tell different tales. We so we Even while building a nation, let us understand that India is a nation in process, and Indian literature is an idea in process. This is how I always look at it. And that's why I am not worried when there is a riot in one part of India, or there is a riot in Andhra Pradesh asking for another state. I am not worried. These are the natural pains of the creation of a nation, because we are slowly becoming a nation. Only very recently we have begun to understand about the cultures in the Northeast. It was never part of our understanding of India. We never knew what was happening in Arunachal, what was happening in Meghalaya. We had not heard of a Garo or Gamut or Mizo or some of those languages of the Northeast, or that they had their own literatures. We never knew about them. So only very recently they have become part of our imagination. So that is why I said India is slowly, right from the days of Bharatavarsha to our own day, this day, India has been slowly growing, evolving, changing. And this is how we need to understand India as a process. And so in that process, there will be, small quarrels. There will be riots. There will be uprisings. All these are nothing but part of the making of an India. And this is also true about Indian literature. It has been in the process, right from the tribal poetry of the Sandals, because it is available in a beautiful English translation by Dr. Hill. So right from the Sandali poetry to what we call modern or postmodern poetry, it is not necessarily a continuous, but then there is a kind of history of ups and downs, a history of exchanges and also of isolated growths. And so there is a whole aesthetic geography out there. And one has to have one's own cartography, one's own method of map making in order to mark, to understand that very difficult and complex terrain of aesthetic geography. So we need literary histories that can reflect our diversity, the diversity of religions, the diversity of races, of regions, and of cultures. And we need to hear, let me say it again and again as a Democrat, we need to hear the suppressed voices. We need to make the inaudible audible. The voice, because Rak Ramsey has a great book called How Democracies Die. From that in my recent talks, where he says that the democracy happens when we begin to hear voices which we have never heard before, and when we begin to see people we have never seen before. And who are these people? The minorities, the Dalits, the tribal people, the ordinary landless peasant, the poor farmer, the villager. So these are the people whom we have never cared for, whom our democracy even has not cared for. And only when these people come to be included in our understanding of India, we can say that we have attained democracy. So I will add one more thing. Indian democracy is also a process. It is not something given to us by the British or something given to us even by our constitution, because even the constitution is challenged, and it can be changed. It can be changed either by the state for its own well-being or by the people for their own well-being. And so we have a nation in progress, we have a literature in progress, we have a culture in progress, we have a literature in progress. True. And so let us not suppress voices of dissent, voices of disagreement. Let us stick to the fundamental principle of democracy, which is nothing but the respect for diversity, the respect for dissent. And when we map Indian literature, when we think of comparative literature, let us again stick to this idea of democracy in literature, literary democracy, which means taking into account oral literature, folk literature, written literature, differences of imagination, differences of languages, differences of cultures, differences of regions, differences of geographies, of fauna, of flora, of rivers, of mountains. So only when we really understand this immense diversity are we going to understand India, understand Indian culture, Indian literature, and develop an inclusive idea of Indian comparative literature. This is what I have to say by way of a very, very brief introduction to comparative Indian literature. Thank you for your patient listening, and I still have some voice and some energy left for taking questions. Maybe maybe 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, now the
Shanisa,
forum
may
is
I?
open for discussion, and as he said, we can take 10 minutes for discussion. Okay.
May I ask a
Yeah,
question?
yes.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for that rare gift of a lecture, in spite of your health and speaking for so long. Anyhow, my question is about poetry and translation. Um, One could say perhaps that poetry is the untranslatable residue of language, but poetry does get translated, poetry must get translated. As an aside, I would also like to submit to you, sir, that my PhD dissertation was a verse translation of Eithachan Sathyatma Ramayanam Kilipattu. That's what I did for my PhD. Well, with a fool's courage, I must say. So I ventured into it, and that's what I did. Anyhow, coming back to my question about poetry and translation. Well, I think this is something that Teju Cole has observed in one of his articles about the question of translation itself. And he says, when his work on the blackness of the panther gets translated into, into Spanish, the Spanish translator apparently could not find an equivalent, rather a word that could contain all the nuances and the resonances of the word blackness. So what the translator did, in fact, was to invent a new word. Nerita is what she invents. I'm told. So that's how she goes about translating the work. Now, my question to you, sir, as a poet, as a translator, as a thinker who is constantly concerned with these many realms, have you made such observations? Have you done so in your own? I mean, you translate your own poems into English. That's one thing. But as it travels to perhaps somewhere like Italian, to a language like Italian, for instance, do you keep track of the transformations? I mean, I'm sure it won't be possible to sort of track every single word and the way it gets transformed. But sort of harping back on my original question about poetry itself and about these nuances of translation, could you, if you could rather, such curious observations, I'd be so delighted to hear it from you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to answer briefly because that question demands another lecture, which I don't have energy enough for. But then, there is this famous saying, famous or notorious, I don't know, that poetry is what is lost in translation. Robert Frost, and this is well known to everybody. But when we speak about the impossibility of translation, because I recently gave another lecture on translation itself and on translation of poetry in particular, when we speak of the impossibility of translation, we forget that we have grown up with the translations of poetry all through our life, right from our early days. If you are a reader of poetry, why poetry but literature? I grew up reading Tagore and Tara Shankar Bandyopadhyay and Thomas Mann, etc. from my school library. From I was 12 or 13, I did not understand much of it at that time, but out of curiosity, because we had two libraries in our village, and we would take these. My brother would read, I would also try to read, and that was how I grew up. And I know this is the story of most of us in my generation and the coming generations too, to a great extent. So we have all grown up on translation, but ultimately, when we grow up on translations, when we are sufficiently fed with the translations, we ask this question: is translation possible? So I think there is a kind of contradiction. Translation is possible. There are problems. There are problems, and let us face it. There are problems in translation, and you may not find one word for. First of all, translation is not a word to word kind of process. Ultimately, it moves from one culture into another. It moves, of course, from one language into another. It moves from one writer's head into another writer's head. By head, I mean here imagination. Because you are living in a poem on translation in Malayalam. I have written the poet is supporting another poet's head on his shoulders when he is translating, and so it's a process of exchange, and sometimes you may not be. And specific example you have given is very true, because for example, in a language like Swedish, there is only one word for blue and green. The word is glass, GLAS. Glass means, for us, it is blue and green, and we, because we are from Kerala, we have many words for even green, not only for blue. We have many, the parrot green and the coconut green and the paddy green and so many greens. But then for the Swedish, it is so on Swedish it is very difficult to make a distinction between the blue and the green because they have only one word. So you are compelled to make a choice. Either choose a word from the words that exist, looking at the context and, if possible, consulting the author if he or she is living, or consulting a scholar who has studied the author thoroughly, or as you suggested, invent a new word. But I am not very much inclined to invent a word, even though I myself have invented at least 200 words in Malayalam. I had to, because when I was writing about Sartre, I was writing about being and nothingness. I was 22 at that time, and I had to invent a lot of words because even for being we did not have a word, and then nothingness. Fortunately, because of the Buddhism, we had a word shunyata. Even though Sartre's nothingness has another meaning also, so you had to bring so to bring that French word with the nuances into Malayalam was not easy. And then there were various other kinds of words for which I had to invent words using my little understanding of Sanskrit, etc. And then later, some of these words became popular. Some came to be established. Like today, we have a word for deconstruction. We use a Kadhanavadam for structuralism. We use, what is it, for deconstruction. What is the word we use? So we have words that we use for many of these words, which are new words, which may be necessary when you in critical concepts. I am not against that, or philosophy, because to convey a concept you may need to invent a word and then explain it for the first time, and later it becomes gradual. But in a creative work, that's what I am coming to say. In a creative work, I am not very much inclined for to use a new word. There may be contexts where you may have to use the original word and then give a footnote, because it may be an irreplaceable word. I have done it even while translating Kabir and Basava. I have done that. Sometimes I have used the original word and then given it a footnote, even though I would also try to avoid footnotes as far as possible. Sometimes it may be necessary. So it is said it is always impossible to translate, and it is always necessary to translate. And that is the
Translate.
dilemma, particularly of people living in India, because we live in a landscape of
Oh,
so many languages.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it is,
yeah.
so we have to keep translating, and sometimes the translation may be original time better than the original, as Borges said. The original does not look like the
Yeah,
translation.
yeah.
And also Marquez said the English version of the 100 Years of Solitude is better than the Spanish original, because it was an edited version, and many unnecessary the unnecessary part, the obesity of the original had been reduced, and some of the clumsy parts had been just edited out in the English translation, and Marquez was very happy. Marquez knew it was being done. Of course, they could not do that without his consent. He agreed. He found that, yes, and because this is something I have also found when I translate even my own poem into English. I find sometimes that, okay, this line was not very necessary. While writing in Malayalam, I was not conscious of that, because English is a language which demands more precision somehow. I'm not saying that one should believe in that kind of hierarchy, but every language has its own qualities and characteristics. So sometimes English has a tendency to be more precise. And so when you translate into English, you find, why did I use these two words? One word was enough. And so I sometimes go back to the original and do a correction there. I revise it has not happened many times, but sometimes even that has happened. So translation has taught me so many things. And when you spoke about Italian, etc., I have translated from Italian, Spanish, etc. But always I have done it from the English version. Except the languages I know. I know some French, I know some Sanskrit, I know some Tamils, I know some and Hindi I know very well. And so I could translate Kabir from Braj directly. But with the other languages, what I do is I translate from the best possible translation. And if there are many translations, I look at all these translations. And when I did Neruda, I did it like that, because Neruda has many translations. And then I sit with somebody who knows the original language. because scholars are available. If you look for them, especially because I live in Delhi, maybe it's a fortune. I could get a Spanish scholar very easily. I could get SP Ganguly, who is a great Spanish scholar who lives in Delhi, who taught at JNU. So I would sit with him and then compare the English, my Malayalam translation, and the original Spanish, and then make the necessary revisions. This I have done also with the translation of my own poems into Italian. I sat with the Italian translator and I explained to her each nuance, and that is how they got into Italian. So there are many such processes involved in translation. They are not. It is not that one person just sits in the room and does that. Sometimes it is done by 2-3 people sitting together in a workshop. Sometimes it is done with the help of an expert. Sometimes it is done in the presence of the original poet. That also I have had that kind of experience. So translation is ever impossible and ever necessary. That is what
I have one more clarification rather, because you mentioned Maveli Nadu Anidingalam. Wasn't that composed by Sahodaran Ayyappan?
Yeah. It is believed that it is attributed to Sahodaran.
Yes.
Even though I am not 10% sure about that, hopefully it was done by him. That is not the example I had in mind. It was Orimuri Karikkundanne. That's what only now I remember the line. Orimuri Karikkundanne Kolla Kolla Kolladaya. So that was the line I really wanted to quote. So yeah, maybe it is. Sure.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Any other question?
Shankar sir, you're mute.
Yeah, Jishil, ask her to.
Giselle, let us wind up. Giselle?
Yes, miss.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that illuminating lecture. Moving on, I would love to invite Miss Adulya B, final year postgraduate student, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Honorable Principal, respected Head of the Department of English, esteemed guest of the day, Professor K. Satchidanandan, teachers and my dear friends, a very good afternoon to all. Gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul. I consider it a great opportunity and a rare privilege to propose the word of thanks on this occasion. First of all, a very big thank you to our chief guest of the day, Professor K. Satchidanandan, for his thought-provoking address on the topic Indian Literature, a Comparative Perspective. Thank you so much, sir. This for us is indeed a glorious moment. My sincere thanks to our respected principal, Dr. K.S. Anil Kumar, for his radiant words of wisdom. We will ever remain grateful to you and thank you for being with us today. I'm also very, very grateful to our respected head of the Department of English, Professor K. Shankaranarayanan, who has always motivated us and is responsible for the success of this event. Thank you, sir. An event of this kind cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling months in advance. We have been very fortunate to have a very active seminar committee. My special and most heartfelt thanks to the coordinator of Theoria 2020, Professor Parvati S., and to the organizing committee, Dr. Sushil Kumar R., Professor Sandrima KV, and Dr. Malini Murli. I wish to thank all my teachers of the Department of English and all the participating faculty. Thank you so much, teachers, for being with us here. And a very big thank you to my dear peers, former students of the department, research scholars, and all those who joined us today making this program a success. I thank you all once again on behalf of KSMDB College and the Department of English. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the patient listening. Thank you.
We have now reached the inevitable concluding part. Let's end on a note of hope in these troubling times. Our next session will be on the topic Anthropocene, Climate, History, Ruminations of an Aesthete, led by Professor P. Harikrishna on 28th October 2020 at 10:30 a.m. Until the next time we meet, this is me, Giselle Stephen, signing off. Thank you.